This isn't the way I thought things were going to go.
You think it's easy being governor of the armpit of America? I just wanted to be the normal governor of a normal state. To sit in my office, eat some sandwiches, and to visit some beaches. Maybe even become president one day. I'd like to make myself very clear to the people of New Jersey, I did not do it.
Welcome to Fort Lee, New Jersey.
Fort Lee is a town with a history dating back to the Revolutionary War. A town with unique demographics and a fascinating story behind them. A town that saw the birth of the cinema industry in the United States, producing an unparalleled cultural impact. A town that would be at the center of an international controversy. All of which would lead up to one climactic event.
Excuse me there, sir. Could you tell us a little bit about Fort Lee's location?
Sure. Fort Lee is located in central Bergen County on the eastern side, overlooking the Hudson River on a formation called the Palisades, formed over 200 million years ago. At under 3 square miles, Fort Lee may be small, but its significance in the past, present, and beyond cannot be understated. The founding of Fort Lee as a town happened on March 29th, 1904, which was split up from the remaining parts of Ridgefield Township. The parts included Pagoda, Leonia, Undercliff, Edgewater, Fairview, Teaneck, Cliffside Park, Englewood, and Palisades Park were all split up in the following act.
So we are here at the famous George Washington Bridge, of which construction started in 1927 and finished in 1931, has 14 lanes and features 2 suspension levels. This bridge is the busiest bridge in the world, accommodating over 103 million cars every single year. This bridge is famous for its place in pop culture, but also for its economic contribution to the town of Fort Lee itself. The name Fort Lee itself is after General Charles Lee, who was a general who led the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Across from us, right here in the distance, was Fort Washington. Fort Washington was the final remaining stronghold that the Americans had on the Manhattan Island before they made their retreat from New Jersey and New York into the Pennsylvania area before the turn of the Revolutionary War. It was from this very point that American artillery barraged British frigates that passed through the Hudson. However, the frigates could not return fire as their cannons would not elevate high enough in order to hit this spot where we're standing right now. On November 13th, 1776, George Washington and 2,000 troops retreated from Fort Washington and crossed the Hudson to where we now stand at Fort Lee. On the 16th of November, General William Howe attacked Fort Washington from the Hudson and from 2 other sides. This led to one of the worst defeats in Revolutionary War history on the American side. This resulted in the surrender of over 2,000 American troops. 3 days later, after the battle at Fort Washington, Fort Lee itself would be abandoned as George Washington made his retreat out of the region and towards Pennsylvania.
We're here at the Fort Lee Museum to learn a little bit more about Fort Lee's rich history in film and cinema production.
We're excited to be speaking with Tom Myers today, who's the executive of the Fort Lee Film Commission, to learn just a little bit about how Fort Lee dominated the 20th century film production in the area.
My grandmother was born in Fort Lee in 1901. She died in 71 when I was 10. So she told me stories about being extra when she was a little girl, and by the time she was a teenager, she was working as a film cutter at Eclair Studios, and when the studios left, she spent the rest of her life in the film laboratories in Fort Lee, including Consolidated. My grandfather and his father worked in the Fox Vault. My mom and her brothers worked in Consolidated Film Laboratories. My mom was there from the time she graduated high school for a decade until Consolidated closed. So, but that wasn't unusual if you were alive in Fort Lee at that time. The biggest employer was the movie studios. Fort Lee was a poor town, but you had 17 major studios. People think they were just these archaic glass buildings. No, you could see, and Fox even more so, they all had big back lots. So what did you need if you had a back lot? You needed carpenters, you needed set designers for interior sets and outdoor sets. So they employed tons of people. Interesting thing too, there were more women that had their own production companies in Fort Lee. When they went to Hollywood, not so much so. Remember, in Fort Lee, it was still a new industry. So you had a lot of immigrants, a lot of Jewish immigrants who were discriminated against, but the movie industry was new, so they didn't get in. Women were able to get in. You had a lot of women having their own production companies in Fort Lee. Alice Guy Blaché built and owned her own studio. That never happened as far as women in Hollywood went. These are really cinema pioneers who paved the way for not only women, but the entire American film industry. Pearl White is one of them. She was an amazing woman who did all her own stunts. Lillian Gish is amazing. She started in Fort Lee in 1912, and she was making films up until the late 80s, Whales of August. She was in the first American gangster film ever filmed. It was in Fort Lee, Musketeers of Pig Alley, which you can get on YouTube. Martin Scorsese came here to Fort Lee when he was shooting Goodfellas, and the reason he came, 90% of that film was shot in New York City. He could have caught the scenes he did in Fort Lee in Queens. He came to Fort Lee to shoot some scenes in that film because Griffith made the first gangster film here. So he's a real film historian. What happened, as I said before, by 1925, most of the action was in Hollywood, so we had a lot of independent production here. So you had people like Oscar Micheaux, who was an African-American filmmaker. He couldn't make films in California because of discrimination, but he had his ability to shoot on the streets of Fort Lee. Fort Lee was a very diverse and open town even then, so they welcomed people like Micheaux in, and Micheaux actually made one of his most important films here in Fort Lee in 1920, Symbol of the Unconquered. It was his answer to Birth of a Nation that Griffith shot in California. He showed the Ku Klux Klan from a black perspective in 1920, which was pretty amazing and gutsy. And so he didn't show them as a glorious group of guys. He showed them for what they were, a racist group of thugs. Nick and Joe Skank. And they were friends and business partners with Marcus Lowe. They came into Fort Lee in 1910 and bought Palisades Amusement Park, and they turned it into a real amusement park. They wanted to compete with Coney Island. So these two guys decided the one thing they didn't have that Coney Island had was salt water and waves. So they built this the largest outdoor salt water pool. They got an engineer to create a waterfall, and behind the waterfall they had paddles, so you would have waves. And how did they get salt water? The piping's still there. They took these pipes, went all the way down to the Hudson River. Every day they would funnel Hudson River water, which is salt, up to the park, and they have these huge filters, which you can see here, and they filter the river water out and make it clean. And then after the park was closed, all the water would go back to the river, and they clean the pool and do it every day. By 1916, they were into the movies with Marcus Lowe. And Roscoe Arbuckle, Fatty Arbuckle, he was working for Mack Sennett, and he was based on the West Coast, but Mack leased a studio in Fort Lee, and he sent Arbuckle and Mabel Normand back east with a crew to make films in Fort Lee. And Arbuckle made some of his most creative films in Fort Lee because Mack Sennett wasn't breathing down his neck. And this is actually shot in Palisades Amusement Park. This is Reckless Romeo, and that survives, although this scene is not in the finished film. this is an iconic picture. When we formed the Film Commission, we wanted to use this as our logo because at the time, when you went to the Library of Congress archive in Washington, D.C., over the archive entrance was this picture. It's such an iconic picture of early American filmmaking. This would be where the bridge is today. And the term cliffhanger started in Fort Lee because these were filmed in Fort Lee, these cliffhangers on the Palisades. And Pearl White, her most famous movie series was Perils of Pauline in 1914. This is 1918. This film doesn't exist anywhere in the United States, according to the Library of Congress. However, Soviet filmmakers, specifically Sergei Eisenstein, loved her, so they imported her films. So that's the reason these films survived. We were at a silent film festival in Italy in 2004, and we spoke with some archivists from Moscow in the film archive there, and they told us they had this film. They sent the video transfer of this film, which is magnificent. So we're trying to get the original print. We have all the video of it. A lot of it, they took the English language intertitle cards out, put Russian title cards in. So we did a rough restoration of this through Rutgers University, and one of our members is a professor down there. So that's the only reason that survives. Now this is an interesting, she never made any films in Hollywood. She was an East Coast filmmaker. Her last films were in the early 20s for Fox. She retired, went to Paris. Interesting story. Interesting lady. However, this director, George Seitz, he ended up going out west to MGM, and he directed a number of films, including a series of Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney films in the 30s that make MGM a lot of money. This guy was a romantic lead in the film. He was from Spain. His name's Antonio Moreno. Now after the silent film period, he went to Mexico and Cuba and directed a lot of films, one of the first really great Latin American directors. And by the 50s, he became a character actor, and he was in John Wayne's The Searchers, and my favorite.
Really?
Wow.
So, yeah.
No way. We just watched that.
Yeah.
Was you remember the older Mexican guy who wouldn't
No
take the blood
way.
money?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
him. And also,
Really?
my favorite film with him is A Creature from the Black Lagoon. He plays the professor.
Which guy is it?
That's
So that's the
Antonio
guy in
Moreno,
this-
right? He was in The
Okay.
Searchers. A very
Gotcha.
interesting guy. The interesting thing, why they came to Fort Lee, one main reason was the development of the subway system. So for a nickel, they could send a crew for the day to 125th Street, where they took a ferry across to Edgewater, and there they could take trolleys or trucks to Fort Lee. What did they find at Fort Lee? Now, Fort Lee, remember Palisades Amusement Park? Before that, Fort Lee was, a lot of people in Fort Lee made their money working for these grand hotels that at one time were on the Palisades. So Fort Lee was, people were very interested in making a buck, and when the movie industry came to Fort Lee, before there were studios built, they saw a main street. Could have been any main street in America, very rural. They saw the north section of town, which could make a lot of westerns, sparsely populated. They saw the cliffs of the Palisades for action-adventure films. So essentially, Fort Lee was about 1.25 miles, big open back lot for them. They could turn a camera in any direction and find another location. And that's why Fort Lee, for that short period of time from about 1908 through 1915-16, really 1917, blossomed and was the first center of film production in the United States, and obviously totally surpassed by Hollywood, because then when they went to Hollywood it was on steroids. I mean, it was huge because they had more land and better weather.
But basically, without Fort Lee, there would be no Hollywood in terms of the development.
Exactly, because we were the template for Studio Town, where everybody worked. It was a factory town. The product was film instead of steel, instead of automobiles. And that template of a film town was taken to Hollywood and just blown up.
The year 1918 proved a death knell to the New Jersey movie industry. A coal shortage imposed by World War I, combined with the coldest winter in decades, caused motion picture companies unable to heat their large studios to curtail filming. The ensuing influenza epidemic after the end of the war forced studios to shutter for weeks on end. That would prove to be the death of the Fort Lee film industry as companies moved to sunny California. Demographics are another very important part of Fort Lee's history, development, and current status today. According to the 2010 census, Fort Lee's demographic breakdown was as follows: 53.5% white, 38.4% Asian, 2.8% black or African American, 3.1% other, 2.1% two or more races, and 0.1% American Indian and Alaskan Native. Also in terms of demographics, according to the 2010 census, 89% of Fort Lee was non-Hispanic or Latino, while 11% of Fort Lee was Hispanic or Latino of any race.
As reported by DataUSA.io, the median household income in Fort Lee was $75,341, substantially higher than the national median income, which is 59,353. The town has a population density of 14,001.7 people per square mile, with 17,446 housing units at an average density of 6,888.5 per square mile.
We are here at the Lewis F. Cole Middle School in Fort Lee, a portion of which was dedicated to being a Japanese school for the children of Japanese immigrants here in Fort Lee. This school would be open on Saturdays and was greatly popular and was responsible for a great influx of Japanese immigrants into Fort Lee. By 1975, the statewide population of Japanese people had risen to 3,000. Many Japanese immigrants found comfort living in Fort Lee due to the fact that their Japanese children could grow up in the context of a Japanese community. A current event in Fort Lee is the debate regarding the placement of a plaque commemorating comfort women. For those of you who don't know, comfort women were sexual slaves used by the Japanese and members of the Japanese army during the Second World War. This is a controversial issue due to the fact that many Japanese people, along with the Japanese government, believe that their reparations are enough in order for them to no longer be reminded of the tragic human rights violation that was comfort women. As a matter of fact, the Japanese government refuses to acknowledge comfort women at all, most of whom were Korean. In the neighboring community of Palisades Park, such a monument was erected. In an attempt to get the monument removed, the Japanese government sent 2 delegations requesting the removal of the monument. However, this sparked a backlash and the request backfired as more and more plaques were put up in various other communities. This is one such community in which the placement of such a plaque is being debated right now. Spurred on by the mayor's support of the placement of the plaque, Fort Lee has decided to go ahead with its installation. The location of the plaque is still yet to be decided. However, it is most likely going to be somewhere such as Constitution Park, which is a different recreational park at Fort Lee. However, one thing is for sure, this monument will be in plain sight for everyone to see, because Fort Lee stands by comfort women.
We're here at Linwood Plaza, one of Fort Lee's major commercial shopping areas, available to Fort Lee residents. There are many different small businesses as well as commercial options available both on Main Street and here at the Fort Lee Linwood Plaza. The presence of H Mart, a Korean-style supermarket, shows the Korean population's influence on Fort Lee's development.
In terms of notable people, Fort Lee has produced successful politicians, members of the military, musicians, actors, business executives, athletes, media personalities, and even a mafia boss. Some notable examples include Bill O'Reilly, who used to be a Fox News pundit, Christopher Perino, who served as the New Jersey Attorney General from 2016 to 2018, and General James Van Fleet, who was a former commanding officer of the U.S. 8th Army. While these are just a few of the people that Fort Lee has produced that have had a significant impact, what's clear is that Fort Lee is a vibrant community full of people of diverse backgrounds who have gone on to accomplish a great deal.
Pay attention, please.
That was totally uncalled for what she did. Like, to pay attention, like, who is she? Is she God? No. So don't ever tell me to pay attention.
I am paying attention.
Hello, comrades. You've reached Russian State TV, Fox News, and I'm your host, Vlad Petrov, John Smith. And we interrupt your questionable reality TV content for some breaking news. The closure of 2 of 3 access lanes to the George Washington Bridge has left Fort Lee in a traffic nightmare. Citizens are angry. Citizens are demanding answers. They want to know, why are these lanes closed? They want to know who done it. Now there's 2 suspects so far in mind. The first, a longtime and beloved history teacher at Tenafly High School, Mr. Barrett. The second is Chris Christie.
One debt to society later.
It was a jolt. It was a punch in the gut to me to hear an individual plead guilty and subject himself to a potential jail term for conducting himself in an intentional way to get to me.
After months of investigations, trials, and news coverage, several things remain unclear, including Christie's involvement in the scandal. Here's what we do know. The lane closures resulted in 2,800 vehicle hours of delay, and were justified as an exercise to study the resulting traffic patterns. But an email from Deputy Chief of Staff Bridget Ann Kelly to David Wildstein, a Port Authority worker, said, quote, "It was time for some traffic problems in Fort Lee." Bridget Ann Kelly, as well as Bill Baroni, who's the Deputy Executive Director of the Port Authority, were brought up on charges by federal prosecutors and found guilty on 7 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud. And while there is no proof that Chris Christie knew about the lane closures, many are suspicious that such a large-scale political retribution event could happen without his knowledge.
4 to 6 more days later.
Hello again, this is your Fox News breaking news alert. Mr. Barrett has been ruled out as a suspect in the Bridgegate scandal, and we've just received shocking footage of Governor Chris Christie on the ocean alone, while the rest of the public cannot access the beach.
Got the whole Jersey Shore just to myself. Perks of being a governor. You know, I heard that Mark Sokolich of Fort Lee isn't supporting my re-election campaign for governor, so I have an idea. I'm gonna close the entire bridge between New York City and Fort Lee, and I'm gonna pretend that I didn't even know about it. You know, that sounds like a good idea.
Now, the last week has certainly tested this administration. Mistakes were clearly made, and as a result, we let down the people we're entrusted to serve. I know our citizens deserve better, much better. Now, I'm the governor, and I'm ultimately responsible for all that happens on my watch, both good and bad. Now, without a doubt, we will cooperate with all appropriate inquiries to ensure that this breach of trust does not happen again.